Right. Okay. So let's get right into it. Rosie, tell us a little bit about yourself and your many, many passions and interests, and what's made you into the writer and performer and singer you are today.
Well, I sometimes think that a quick answer to that is I was raised by libraries. I was raised by public libraries. I was saying earlier to Cal that I'm from a working class background, and we couldn't afford to have a lot of books around the house. Well, we couldn't afford to buy a lot of books, but the house was full of books. And one of my favourite memories is going to the library with my mum on a Saturday, and I'd be let loose in the library and I was able to choose 4 books, and all I had to do was take them home and love them and read them, and then the next Saturday I would go back and choose 4 more books. And I got through the kids' library pretty quickly, and with a little bit of guidance I was let loose in the adult section. The librarians told me which books I wasn't allowed to read. And so reading, it's not just writing, but what started me writing was reading, because what happened was that I enjoyed reading, and so what started me writing was I started writing stories for my dolls. They were very good listeners, and it kind of started from there, really.
Yeah, that's really exciting. That's a captive audience there. So you do so much and have all these talents, and are your creative practices connected in some way?
Well, the short answer is I think everything's connected, how to say? I feel that I don't like to be limited. I like to explore all kinds of creativity, and sometimes I'll have a story that I want to write, and that story can be written in 500 words. So it'll be a piece of flash fiction. Sometimes the story is far, far longer, like with The Night Brother or The Palace of Curiosities, and that goes on for 90,000 words. And I couldn't put it in 500 words. And sometimes it's something completely off out into outer space, and that might turn out into be a poem. And sometimes, just sometimes, things fall into the spaces in between. So there are things that aren't necessarily fitting a poem or don't fit a short story. And personally, I think the idea that I write things that don't fit absolutely suits the whole idea of being queer, and never really fitting the mainstream. So my writing is bound to not fit in a lot of ways either.
Yeah, that's really...
Rosie...
Oh, sorry, carry on. No, carry on, Cal.
So would you say, Rosie, that's very interesting. So like you say, the fact that your writing doesn't fit into the mainstream, I think that's wonderful, because do you think as an author that your writing acts? I mean, I certainly think this, so this is partly my own opinion. Would you say that you like to think you're writing as an inspiration for people who would like to be different, who struggle maybe to break from those mainstream traditions, and by reading, the stories, the themes that you go by, might take some inspiration from that?
Well, if they do, then that is wonderful. I do write the stories that I want to read. I can remember again growing up that although I loved libraries, I didn't necessarily see me in many of the stories. I really projected myself hard into stories, and where I didn't find myself, I slipped myself in. I would sometimes, they call it fan fiction now, but some of my earliest stories were me writing the stories I read, but putting people like me into them.
Yes.
Yes. And it's like, so I think fan fiction is fantastic. I'm not one of these people who's dead snooty about it. I think it's a great way of weird people and queer folk getting themselves into stories. Oh God, I've kind of forgotten the question. Yeah.
So basically,
I don't see any of my writing as being like a sermon or polemic.
No, of course. No.
I want, it's like I want to tell the damn story. But I think one of the reasons I use historical fiction in my fiction, like with Night Brother, is I want to explore, I get these ideas, I want to explore big ideas about sexuality and fluid gender identity, but I'm not going to write an essay about it. People do wonderful essays about it. But I think about the story, like, well, what would it be like to struggle with the binaries and struggle with them in 1900? And what might that look like in a slightly magical, realist, but in reality way? And does that?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, because I think it's about being creative as possible. Because of course, with traditional fiction, I mean, the LGBT community, you know, I mean, however you identify, I think are often, if they are featured, which is very rare in classic literature, for example, I think their characters play a very limited role. Either that, or it's hinted through what I find often quite derogatory language techniques, that that person might be gay or bisexual, or might be non-binary or gender fluid.
Yeah.
And I think that by putting the context of that into a creative piece of writing and introducing all these mystical, wonderful, magical themes, I think that's astonishing. I think it's great.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, and there is that thing about hidden histories, and I'm actually going to be really naughty, and I'm going to read a poem here.
Yay!
Wonderful.
I am going to slip a couple in, and it's from, here's a big plug, it's from my collection, What Girls Do in the Dark, which is, oh, people waving the book, and I mean, goodness, what a cover. You've done me proud. And it was inspired by an old postcard that I found, and I flipped it over, and on the back it was written by one woman to another woman, and it felt like a really tender postcard. And the cover of the picture on the postcard was of a wishing well, and on this wishing well, right in the corner, were these two women standing very, very close together. And so I made up a story, and this is it. It's called Long Exposure. If asked, they'll say it's purely for the postcard photographer who arranged the scene. Over there, a chap with an unlit pipe, and there, a mother and daughter by the well's mouth. And the pair of them, Miss Jansel and Miss Nellie Meek, snarled up at the kissing gate. They embrace for the long wind and snap of the shutter. 3 minutes they hold the kiss. Tomorrow they will go back, Miss Jansel and Miss Nellie Meek, and wish again, and kiss, without photographer, the clank and rattle of equipment. They will keep wishing, kissing through the years of hiding in long grass, behind bushes, in closets, in plain sight, pale-knuckled against all that would put them asunder, shoulder to shoulder, till everything that twists fear into law unwinds. When time comes to unknot concealment, shrug off its whalebone cage, till they can put an end to wishes, stand up, brush off their skirts, and act.
Wonderful.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Rosie.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
And that was all from finding an old postcard and thinking and just imagining the story that came out of the postcard.
I think inspiration is everywhere around us, isn't it? It's just kind of looking at it through a different kind of lens. So do you get inspiration from real life? Can you give us some examples perhaps from Night Brother, or can you tell us a little bit more about what sort of inspires you?
I am inspired by people who don't fit. You can call them outsiders if you want to, although I do think that, like, the thing about being an outsider is being outside. If you are outside, that's inside. Outside feels like inside if you're there. It's all depends on where you're standing. But I'm interested in people who won't fit and refuse to fit the kind of really narrow models and templates that society offers us. You know, that, I don't know if anyone remembers if they ever had this toy when they were a kid, which is like this little wooden bench with holes in it, all different shapes, like there's a star hole, a square hole, a round hole, a moon-shaped hole, and then you're given pegs and you have to hammer them through the right hole. And I always felt it's like, you know, the whole idea of a square peg in a round hole. I always felt that I was like a star-shaped peg, and society, my mum and dad, you know, God love them, wanted to kind of hammer me into a hole that didn't fit. And I think one of my first experiences was the power of saying no and kind of just refusing that. I think that's like one of the first acts of rebellion, to kind of go, no, I'm not doing that. And sorry, I just could talk for England. But that's a lot of where I get my inspiration from. I think, like, what would it be like if, so in Palace of Curiosities, my debut novel, it's set in a Victorian circus, and amongst the strange people that live in the circus, including a young woman who's born completely covered in hair, so she's visibly very, very different, and her companion, who's a man who is equally strange, but you can't tell by looking at him. So the difference between visible difference and invisible difference. And I'm sure there's quite a lot of folk here who, it's that idea of like being LGBTQ, and sometimes you can pass for straight, but do you want to?
I fully understand that, actually. I think that's very interesting because, if I may jump in there, I think that's very interesting because how you feel about yourself and how you present yourself can often be, it can almost become a contradiction. I mean, somebody like me, for example, you know, if you don't mind me saying so, who comes from a council estate, who comes from, you know, very industrial, very northern background where social norms were very much the thing. I found it very confusing growing up because around me were all these staunch socialists that were telling society that society was corrupt. But yet I also had people telling me that I couldn't wear makeup and that I couldn't grow my hair long and that I couldn't paint my nails. But when I was inside, like you say, outside, you present yourself as this strong person who's aspiring to go to university. But when you go home, all that you want to do is try on makeup and paint your nails, but you've got to take it off before you go back outside. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
I know things have changed, and I know things are different to like maybe when I was a kid, and thank God, because, you know, there have been advances, and I actually think this idea of feeling that you don't fit is kind of universal. I think I've yet to meet anybody, whether they're straight, queer or whatever, who hasn't at some point felt that they didn't quite fit. And this makes me think about another thing, which is, you know, this whole concept of normal. And wow, we're still being pushed the whole idea of normal. And
what do we call normal?
Maybe it's weird, but I don't actually think normal exists.
No, I don't.
It's this kind of bizarre concept that kind of exists out there in the twinkly nowhere, and kind of continually trying to aspire to normal, whether you're whoever you are. It just seems you're never going to get there. You're chasing something that doesn't exist, so therefore you're never going to be it, and you've got to kind of make yourself sort of miserable. And that is one of the themes underlying The Night Brother, for example, because you've got Edie and Gnome, without giving spoilers, you've got these twins, Edie and Gnome, a boy and a girl, and they're both really, really hung up on this idea of being, you know, the brother is really hung up on the idea of being a real man and being manly, and the girl, Edie, is really sort of like desperate to be a good girl and a normal girl and make her mother happy and love her. And and you know, again, without giving too much of the novel away, like continually trying to be this perfect idea of like a real man or a real woman, that isn't going to make them very happy. So you'll have to read the novel and find out if they do get happy and how. That was another plug, by the way.
I'll definitely put that on my list. It sounds very interesting. I'm excited to read this phenomenon that you've captured and put it into a historical period. That's
Edwardian Manchester, and there are suffragettes as well.
Lovely.
So, yeah, you've got to have a suffragette.
As we've moved on to Night Brother, Rosie, can you tell us if you had any inspiration behind kind of writing a tale of gender, sexuality, and being true to yourself? I mean,
just summed it up, Anita. You just summed up the novel. I guess it's like, you know, everyone finds their own path through the world, and has a very personal relationship with their gender and sexuality. I've got my own personal relationship with my gender and sexuality. And again, Night Brother is an exploration, and a fictional exploration. It's not a polemic. It's not saying this is how gender should be, this is how gender identity should work. It's a story. It's it has fantastical elements in it. But it's just exploring the idea of acceptance, self-acceptance, what is normal anyway, how can we find happiness, how can we build a space for our weird selves in the world. Yeah that's I think that's great, and I think that individuality, and I think that accepting yourself and being comfortable with yourself is often one of the key routes to happiness. So to have that placed into a story, even though the characters might only be fictional, and even though they might come from another time frame, I think that having them to look at, because I think characters can be an inspiration, and I think that the characters that we develop, I mean, I'm not a writer, but you know, I think we all think about, you know, what could things have been like, and are there people out there that have felt exactly like I do? It's about finding them. Yeah, and being given permission to dream and inspire. I mean, I read a lot of not exactly fantastic literature, but certainly out there books when I was little. I mean, one of the first books I really remember reading and absolutely loving was Alice Through the Looking Glass. Because it was just the idea of another world that felt really real but didn't obey any of the rules. And then I read Edgar Allan Poe, which introduced me to just how thrilling it is to be scared shitless. And be scared shitless, but it's in a book. And that was given to me for my 9th birthday by an aunt. She lived in the States, and I think people in the States have got a slightly different idea about what constitutes appropriate literature for children. My mum and dad didn't know I'd been given the stories of Edgar Allan Poe at the age of 9, or I think they would have taken them away from me. But yeah, you know, it's yeah, I learned that you can create scary and fascinating and fantastic worlds through words, and I think I was hooked from that moment on. I really was.
It's wonderful.
And I'm just curious about your characters, Rosie, because you write your prose in sort of first person. You've got this first person point of view, and your characters are telling their own stories, essentially. Why do you find it so important that they do that? You don't have a narrator that you know. Tell us a little bit about your characters and their voices.
Yeah, I do. Certainly in my novels, some of my short fiction is written from different points of view, but in my novels, I do write from first person, and that is really conscious. Again, growing up with a lot of slightly weird literature, I noticed that I heard this rule that if you're writing an unusual or a queer character, don't write it in first person because it will alienate the reader. Yeah, exactly. I did that face as well. And I can't even begin to say how passionate I am about how important it is for us to tell our own stories. And using first person means that we, you know, the weird folk, us, the strange folk, aren't getting filtered through the point of view of this default, normal, straight, white, etc., narrator. I mean, you know, just to take a really cheesy example, Anne Rice's first novel, Interview with the Vampire, was an interview with a vampire. The normal human being interviewed the weird outsider. You know, Angela Carter, one of my absolute sheroes, don't get me wrong, when she wrote Nights at the Circus, which features a woman with wings, she's being interviewed as well. Even Feathers in Nights at the Circus, she doesn't tell her own story. That is filtered through the normal non-circus. And so I just thought, I'm not having this. When I wrote The Night Brother and Palace of Curiosities and Vixen, I was really determined that the queer folk, the weird folk, the outsider folk got to tell their own story without somebody telling it for them. Ta-da, there you go.
I think that's great. And I think until you hear the story from the perspective of the outsider, understanding the outsider becomes rather difficult, because like you say, it's filtered down. And often I think what happens, especially with books that I've read, I think that the narrator, I don't know how to put this, I think the narrator almost comes to me it becomes quite derogatory. It becomes sort of an underlying judgment of the outsider, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It does, and it's like that. But it's always assumed that the narrator is normal and is imposed their worldview, and it's just like, excuse me, got plenty to say. Thank you very much.
Good for you.
In another poem, so there you go. Because right, and it's all about this idea of like what is outside and breaking the rules. And it's one of my outer space poems, once again, from this book, and. Because again, I think everything's connected, and I'm fascinated. I was useless at science at school. I failed science at school heroically, but I've become really interested in it. And I really like the idea that right at the edge of our solar system, things get weird. You've got planets like Pluto that were called a planet, and then they were told they weren't a planet. And then the geeks of the world made a fuss, and Pluto's been told it's a planet again. And I don't think Pluto cares. I don't think Pluto is at all interested, really. And so this is a poem about all those weird planets right at the edge of the solar system, which rather beautifully are called trans-Neptunian objects. Way out there between matter and not quite void, they weave in rocky gangs, ragtag remnants of the solar system, sober gathering. They crash each other's parties, spit geysers of methane ice, and break the law of what is and isn't planet. They will not kneel in perfect circles round the sun, won't toe any ordered line. There's naught so queer as Pluto, Sedne, Eris, Thula, Mache. Shoved too far for any naked eye, it only looks like lonely. Their faces cratered with a million kisses, their drunken stagger round the solar system so leisurely that we have galloped from cave to red button in the time it takes them to notch a handful of orbits. They squint at our blur. We are grit in their eye. Blink and we're long gone.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Rosie.
Thank you very much.
You're getting a big clap from around the room.
Like big clap.
Thank you so much. No, that was fantastic. It's amazing how you find outsiders and everywhere, anywhere you look, really.
Up in the sky, yeah.
Now, I was just curious about some of your other characters who've got this weird sort of werewolf syndrome. I googled it actually. It's called hypertrichosis, isn't it? It's a condition where you get sort of excessive hair growth on your body. So that really struck me about your poem, What Girls Do in the Dark. So I was just curious how you got an interest in this and why quite a few of your characters seem to present these symptoms.
Some of it comes from well, the whole idea that we're not supposed to be hairy, or if women are hairy, it's all got to be here on our heads and nowhere else, which again, and it's like, am I the only person that thinks it's kind of that the idea of a completely shaved adult woman is a physical ideal, because hairless women are children? Anyway, we won't go there. That's because that's a little bit creepy. But women do have, and particularly women, but men as well, do have a fraught relationship with hair. And so when I wrote my first novel, Palace of Curiosities, I thought, well, let's just completely tip it on its head. And so Eve, who is the lion-faced girl, who is the girl who's completely covered in hair, she not only gets to tell her own story, very important, but I also wanted to represent her as beautiful. And so that was one of the things that felt very important to me, that she isn't demeaned or derided, like you said, Cal, as somebody who's ugly and hairy. It was really important to me that she got to tell her own story. And actually, she is beautiful. Not in a kind of sickly, saccharine way, but she has agency, she owns her own life, and, finds happiness that isn't twee. And yeah, that's kind of filtered into my poems as well. The title poem of What Girls Do in the Dark is about two sisters. And shall I read it?
Do you take requests? I was going to say, can you read that? Yes, please.
So it's What Girls Do in the Dark. My sister goes missing for nights at a time. She's always home by the time Mum bangs on the door and yells at us to get out of bed, so there's no point in telling. Not that I would. I set my phone to wake me at 5 a.m. Her bed's still empty. I almost fall asleep again, but at past, she comes through the window, gathering her legs beneath her in a crouch and flattening her ears. Mum'll never believe you, she says, reeling in her tail. She takes a deep breath and turns her skin the other way, so hair is on the inside and girl is on the outside. Show me, I say. Her eyes glimmer. When you're ready. I didn't say never. You'll be good at it soon. But first, stop asking. So
fabulous.
Yes, thank you. Again. And so the kind of, is she a werewolf or isn't she? And the idea is what we hide. I was thinking about, that whole idea of like, I had a younger sister, and there were things that we shared with each other and things we hid from each other. And I'm just thinking about the things that we do hide and the things that we show. And I sometimes grew up feeling that like I had hair on the inside and girl on the outside, and that I became a very different person in my dreams. I felt free in my dreams to be the strange character that I wanted to be. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really amazing. So you've squeezed. So in what girls do in the dark, you've can people see it? I've blurred my background. You've squeezed in sort of fantasy, LGBTQ plus and gothic themes, and then science and space as well. Is there a link? Is there a connection? What sort of what brings it all together?
Well, I think that poem Trans-Neptunian Objects brings a lot of it together. The idea that you find weirdness everywhere. It's like nowhere, even the solar system, nowhere is normal and straight. Everything is bent. Everything is weird. So it's like, and I do think that everything is connected. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I've got so interested in astronomy, like looking up looking into the outside world and looking to outer space and learning about inner space. And there are a number of poems that play with that idea of outer space being reflected in inner space and inner space being reflected in outer space. And there's one about a comet that's a dog. And so it's like, and I do like this idea of telling small stories, outer space. Much as I would like to enjoy the science programs with the fabulous Professor Brian Cox, I don't understand them. They're too sciencey for me. I kind of need my stories a little bit smaller, I think. Maybe that's because I was just so useless in school at science. But yeah, I do think everything's connected, and finding those connections they're another reason. They're really the underpinning reason I write, full stop, is to make connections and bring connections. And when I write, I like to leave enough space for the reader to get in, if that makes sense. We've all read poetry and we've all read stories which feel they're kind of holding us at a distance, and that's fine. Lots of people write in different ways. I don't want to write poetry that shuts people out. I don't want to write stories that shut people out. I want to kind of welcome people in and have space for their own thoughts. I want space for my own thoughts. And it only seems to be fair to share that with other people, really.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you, Rosie. Now I've got a personal curiosity, kind of trolling the internet and looking you up and sort of finding out more things about you. I'm just admitting all of this now, but like your alter ego on stage, Rosie Lugosi. We were going to get into this, weren't we? The lesbian vampire queen. Like, what is the connection between Rosie and your poems or novels? Is there one? Do you get inspiration from that character?
Well, it's like, she doesn't necessarily influence my work because she's part of my work. I created her and I wrote her, and she is a sort of alter ego. And there was I created her in the 90s, the 1990s, not the 1790s. I created her in the 1990s because it was at a pretty bizarre time. It was just after Section 28, and all of that crap that was going on, and the rise of the really anti-gay time. And I created Rosie Lugosi as somebody who was absolutely fearless. She was a vampire. She was a goddess. She was a queen, completely fearless. And yeah, she was, she was a radical drag act. When I was dressed up and in my wig and in my heels and in my fangs, I was 6 foot tall. And I did have people come up to me and ask me if I was a drag queen, if I was a man dressed as a woman. And you can do your Judith Butler and talk about performativity of gender, but I was fully embracing and embodying this completely disobedient and outrageous character who could say anything she wanted to. So there. And so she was a wonderful creation. I still bring her out on rare occasions because she's so much fun.
Is there anything, Rosie, it's funny you should say with having that alter ego, you say it's a kind of alter ego, but would you say that you've blended a lot, despite being an alter ego and a character, how much of you would you say is is your character? Have you put quite a lot of you into her, and the opinions you have?
I couldn't possibly say. Well, yeah, of course she's going to be speaking my opinions, because I don't tell lies.
No.
Even my story, even though all my stories are made up, there's a
lot of truth in them.
Emily Dickinson said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And I guess that's what I'm doing. I'm telling the truth and telling it slant. So yeah, she was. Rosie Lugosi is a kind of stand-up comedian. She's a singer. She sings perverted songs, and she's funny. And because I am a great believer in the power of humour to change people's minds. While they're laughing, you can slip the messages under the radar, and people go, "Oh my God, I've just realised I've changed my mind. Queer people are fabulous," you know. So yeah, change people's minds while they're laughing.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I think the great thing is, like you say, the 1990s, it was very much time. It was a very bizarre time, because sort of towards the end of the late 90s, we saw this big rise, in a lot of, music and in literature and in media in the general. We saw kind of this big rise in girl power and this staunch feminism. And we saw people really combating those social norms. But in the early 1990s, which is, I presume, the time that you created, this fantastic character, there was still a lot of it was sort of post HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. It was that a big inspiration for the character.
And absolutely brilliant to see sort of like the radical drag performers who are just rocking it now, absolutely rocking it, Cheddar Gorgeous, Licorice Black. I could go on for hours, and it's just amazing to see just how people have just picked this up and are just going with it. Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. Fantastic. So what time are we on? I'm a little bit conscious of the time.
Oh yeah, we're at 6:10. I've just looked at
yes,
the clock.
sorry. So I've just got one more question, Rosie, and then we're gonna stop the recording and sort of take it out to the audience. Are you working on something new at the moment? And if you are, can you give us a sneak preview?
Right, I'm working on a few things, one of which some of the folk in this group might be interested in. With lovely West Midlands Readers Network, I'm setting up a reading group for people who are poetry curious. It's only going to be 5 sessions to start with, and it's free. And so if anyone is interested in finding out more about a poetry reading group, don't have to be a poet, just curious, then Anita is going to sort of like paste my address, my email address, not my home address, don't pop round, post my address into the chat feature. So please do get in touch about that. That's one thing I'm really excited about. Another thing is I am writing a novel. Of course I'm writing a novel, it's what I do, I write novels, but I'm finishing off my 4th novel, which is it's kind of a haunted novel. It features it's got Edwardian lesbians who, let's face it, are the best lesbians ever, and it's also about like, what are we haunted by, what haunts us, what is a ghost, is it really somebody with a sheet over their head? So I'm working on that, and that's coming to an end. And I'm something that's, I have to admit, something that's kept me, let's use the C word, COVID, something that has helped keep me grounded over this past bizarre batshit year is not just writing, but reading, being able to like lose myself in the world of a book.
That sort of escapism.
Yeah, but it's been bizarrely grounding. I don't feel like I've flown off into outer space. I feel that entering the world of a book and maybe sharing that with other people has really helped with a sense of community and feeling grounded and feeling real. And this last year has felt so unreal that anything that helps connect again. Hey, we're back to connection, has got my vote. And I'm also one of the very lucky people who has managed to write during lockdown. A lot of my friends have really struggled to write, and I'm one of these lucky people. Well, you know, I've been doing all kinds of routines and rituals just to get myself started, like morning pages and, you know, doing a 20-minute burst of writing just to keep going. So yes, so poetry reading group, new novel, and who knows what else.
You got any new poetry in the I mean, I know you've just written What Girls Do in the Dark, but
do you know the one thing, I mean, I'm so lucky I do write fiction, because the one thing that I've really struggled to write over the last year is poetry. I don't know why, but poetry has largely eluded me. I have written a couple. I've written a lot of little teeny stories, flash fiction. I've been writing this novel, but poetry's been difficult. So I'm very glad that I write in lots of different forms.
Thank you, Rosie. That's been amazing. I'm just going to stop the recording now, so we are going to go on to questions from people in the room.